When is a time you should have been in tears, but felt stone cold emotionless? I always thought I was the type of person who would break down at the big moments, when the emotional weight became too much to bear. But I learned that day, the day I should have been in tears, that grief doesn't always follow a script. Sometimes, instead of sobbing or screaming, you're left feeling absolutely nothing, stone cold, as though your mind and heart have shut down to protect you from the flood that should be drowning you. This is the story of that day, and it haunts me still. It started like any other day. I woke up to the soft hum of my phone vibrating on the bedside table. The sun was just starting to rise, casting an orange glow through the curtains. I lazily reached for my phone, expecting a notification or two from work or maybe a message from a friend. Instead, I saw a missed call from my mom, followed by a single text, "Call me back. It's urgent." My stomach immediately dropped. You know that feeling when you sense something's wrong, but you can't put your finger on it yet? That was it, right there in the pit of my stomach, a gnawing sense of dread. My mom never sent messages like that unless something had happened. I sat up, shaking the sleep from my body as I dialed her number. She answered on the second ring, her voice tight and strained. I could tell she'd been crying. "Mom?" I said, my voice sounding small, even to myself. "What's going on?" There was a long pause. A pause so heavy that it filled the room with tension. And then, she said the words that should have broken me. "It's Dad, he's gone." I didn't understand at first. My mind refused to process it. I stared at the wall, blinking, as if I hadn't heard her right. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice coming out quieter than I expected. "He died early this morning," she whispered, choking on the words. "A heart attack. He didn't make it." There was another pause, but this time it wasn't filled with tension. It was filled with nothingness. Complete and utter nothingness. I sat there on my bed, gripping the phone tightly as if it might suddenly give me the answers I was searching for. My dad? Gone? The man who raised me, who had always been there, was just dead? I should have been crying, right? That's what you do when you hear news like this. You break down, the grief rushes in, and your body betrays you with sobs. But instead, I felt absolutely nothing. Stone cold. "I'll come over," I finally managed to say, though it felt like I was on autopilot. My mom said something in response, but I barely heard her. I ended the call and just sat there, staring at the phone in my hands. Why wasn't I crying? Why wasn't I feeling anything? It didn't make sense. I had loved my dad. He had always been a part of my life, and now he was gone, just like that. But instead of grief, I felt a strange kind of emptiness. It was as though the world had just become quieter, as though everything was happening around me, but I wasn't a part of it. I got dressed, moving like a robot through the motions, and then drove over to my parents' house. It was surreal, driving through the streets as if it were any other day. Cars honked, people walked their dogs, and the world just kept turning, oblivious to the fact that my life had just changed forever. When I arrived at the house, my mom was sitting in the living room, clutching a tissue in her hand. Her face was red and blotchy from crying, and her eyes were puffy and swollen. She looked at me with an expression that was a mixture of grief and relief that I was there, that she wasn't alone. She stood up, and I expected her to fall into my arms, to cling to me as she cried. But instead, she just stood there, looking at me, as though she was waiting for me to break down. She was waiting for me to show the emotion that I should have been feeling, but it wasn't there. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want you to hear it like that." "It's okay," I replied automatically, but it wasn't okay. None of it was okay. We sat down on the couch, and she started talking, recounting what had happened. How she had found him that morning, unresponsive in bed, and how she had called 911, but it had been too late. I listened, nodding in all the right places, but I felt disconnected, like I was watching a scene in a movie. This wasn't my life. This wasn't happening to me. At some point, my mom asked me if I wanted to see him. His body had been taken to the funeral home, and they were offering us the chance to say our goodbyes. Again, I nodded, even though I didn't know if I was ready for that. But I went along with it, because that's what you do when your parent dies. You go through the motions. When we arrived at the funeral home, the cold, sterile air hit me like a wall. The lights were dim, and the air smelled faintly of flowers, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of smell that clung to you, reminding you that you were in a place of mourning. They led us to the small viewing room where my dad's body had been prepared. And there he was, lying in a casket, looking so peaceful. It was strange. I had never seen a dead body before, and I thought I would be scared or horrified, but I wasn't. I was just numb. My mom started crying again as she stood by the casket, her fingers brushing against his hand. I stood beside her, staring down at my dad, but feeling nothing. I wanted to feel something, grief, sadness, anything, but it was like my emotions had been shut off. I just stood there, cold and empty, as my mom sobbed beside me. After a while, she turned to me, her eyes filled with tears. "Aren't you going to say goodbye?" she asked, her voice cracking. I looked at her, then back at my dad. Say goodbye? How could I say goodbye when I hadn't even processed that he was gone? "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice sounding hollow. She gave me a sad smile, reaching out to squeeze my hand. "Just say whatever's in your heart." But that was the problem. There was nothing in my heart. I was completely empty. The days that followed were a blur. We made funeral arrangements, contacted family members, and did all the things you're supposed to do when someone dies. Through it all, I remained emotionless, going through the motions without ever really feeling anything. I thought maybe at the funeral, when I saw everyone gathered to say their goodbyes, it would hit me. Maybe then I would cry. But even then, as I stood by the grave, listening to the eulogies, I felt nothing. I was stone cold. It wasn't until a few weeks later, after the funeral, after everyone had gone back to their normal lives, that the numbness started to wear off. I was sitting at home, alone, staring at the framed picture of my dad that I had placed on the mantel. It was a picture of him from my graduation day, smiling proudly as he stood beside me, his arm wrapped around my shoulder. I had looked at that picture a dozen times since his death, but for some reason, that day was different. I stared at his face, at the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and suddenly, it hit me like a freight train. He was really gone. My dad was gone, and I would never hear his voice again, never see him smile, never feel his arms around me. The reality of it all crashed down on me, and the tears finally came. I cried for what felt like hours, the sobs racking my body as I collapsed onto the floor. The numbness was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of grief that I had been holding back for weeks. It was like my body had finally allowed itself to feel, and all the emotions I had been suppressing came flooding out at once. In that moment, I realized that grief doesn't follow a timeline. It doesn't hit you when it's supposed to, and sometimes, it doesn't hit you at all, until it does. Everyone processes loss differently, and for me, it took time for the reality to sink in. But when it did, it was like a dam had broken, and there was no stopping the flood. I've thought about that day many times since then, the day I should have been in tears, but felt nothing. And I've come to understand that it wasn't because I didn't care or because I wasn't grieving. It was because my mind and body weren't ready to face the truth yet. They were protecting me from the pain, giving me time to process everything in my own way, in my own time. Grief is a strange and unpredictable thing. It doesn't always look the way we expect it to, and sometimes, it sneaks up on us when we least expect it. But eventually, it finds its way to the surface, and when it does, there's no escaping it. In the end, I did say goodbye to my dad, but it wasn't at the funeral or in that cold viewing room. It was in my own time, in my own way, and it was real. And maybe that's what matters most.